I assume you have all watered your horses and fed them and everything, if you've done yourselves and you're ready to move along with the program. And Captain Clark, was he good or was he good? Was he worth it? Was he off? Good job. Okay, you all will figure that out pretty soon. It takes a while. It's a really difficult kind of cheer, you know. I mentioned a guy by the name of Charles Paxley, I think, earlier. We got this email from a friend of ours, and this is what you have in store for you tomorrow night at the dinner theater. This individual said, "We heard Charles Paxley's talk in Orangeburg this weekend. It's sensational. Maximum publicity should be given it. 95% of the battlefield is not covered by water." Now, Charles is going to tell you what battlefield that is tomorrow night, I hope. Call the Post and Courier and get the major reporter up here to Manning for the talk. For God's sake, 3 major battles of the American Revolution. I don't know what that has to do with Francis Marion, but Kings Mountain and Cowpens, I don't think Marion made it there, and then Utahville. So anyway, Charles is here now, and just to let him know that we're glad he's here.
Hip hip! Hoorah! Thank you, George.
Now this is our cheering section.
And Charles Paxley is one of those that, I'll talk more about this tomorrow night, but if there's anything about the Southern campaign that's being pushed to bring it to light, it's usually got Charles Paxley involved in it. And I don't know how many times he met with Carol and I when we were really wondering whether we wanted to do another symposium or not, and we'd go eat somewhere in Sumter, and he reinforced what Chris and Bob Swager were saying. It went something like, you know, if not you, who? We're still looking for that who too. Anybody here want to volunteer? You know, you got it right now. Our next presenter is going to talk about the Battle of Savannah. I think Captain Clark referenced that. So Christopher, over to you.
I'm a little intimidated to be following Captain Clark because during the break somebody asked me where my uniform was. I'd like to thank you for inviting me to come up from Savannah. I know that this is mostly a South Carolina crowd, but I do have roots. My dad is from Pickens, so I figured that counts. Now, one very important fact that people often forget when they're discussing the American Revolution is the fact that it was more than a revolution. It was also a civil war, which found friends, neighbors, even family members on opposing sides. Fully 1/4 of the colonists, 1 in 4, remained loyal to the crown and had no desire to create a new nation. In Georgia, the youngest of the colonies, and one that fit extremely well into the English government's mercantilist policy, the percentage of loyalists was even higher. After France agreed to recognize the United States and form an alliance, Georgia, as a base of military operations, must have appeared very appealing to the British, who suddenly had to rethink their whole military strategy. But my job today is to talk to you about the Battle of Savannah from an American perspective, and which you basically can sum up in one word: confusion. To fully understand the Battle of Savannah from the American point of view, you need to back up and look at Savannah's role in the early years leading up to 1779, the year of the battle. On the eve of the Revolution, Savannah was a small town consisting of about 450 structures, with a population of about 1,600 people, 750 whites, 800 to 900 blacks. A British soldier described the town saying, "The houses lie scattered and are poorly built, mostly of wood. In short, the whole has a most wretched, miserable appearance." Our tourist board does not quote that. A Hessian soldier complained that the sand is so deep that it is just like walking through fresh fallen snow a foot deep. A man runs no small risk of being choked by the clouds of sand and dust. What made this small, poorly developed town important was the fact that it was the colonial capital of the colony and a port. Now, the first time that political upheaval really began to occur in Georgia happened after Parliament passed the Stamp Act in 1765. Here's another view. James Haversham, president of the Royal Council, summed up the situation nicely when he observed, "How must every inhabitant shudder at the thought of this act taking place?" When the colonists protested, Georgia's agent in London, William Knox, defended the law. The Assembly fired him, and later asked Benjamin Franklin to represent the colony's interests. Tensions ran high in the streets of Savannah, but for the most part, Governor James Wright was able to keep a lid on things. Still, there were some demonstrations. On Guy Fawkes Day, November 5th, 4 days before the act went into effect, after it went into effect, 4 sailors dressed up one of their members as a stamp distributor on a scaffold and paraded him around the town, leaving a crowd, according to the newspaper, highly diverted by the humor of the tars. Even with such demonstrations, however, Georgia was only one of 4 colonies that did not send delegates to the Stamp Act in Congress in New York. Governor Wright persuaded them not to go, though one observer went over the governor's objections. When the act went into effect, November 1st, 1765, there wasn't a single stamp salesman in the colonies. That was because mobs had threatened them into resigning, except in Georgia. Georgia's stamp agent, George Angus, didn't arrive until January of 1766. The stamps arrived aboard the ship Speedwell, which landed without any kind of protest. They were moved under guard to Fort Halifax in the town. Later, a mob of 200 people gathered to seize the stamps, but Governor Wright and 50 soldiers backed them down. Georgia has the dubious distinction of being the only colony which issued any of the stamps before Parliament overturned the law. Governor Wright insisted that they be used on the paperwork required to release 60-odd ships that were in port. When the Sons of Liberty in Charlestown heard about this, they were livid, declaring no provision should be shipped to that infamous colony, Georgia, that every vessel trading there should be burnt, and whosoever should traffic with them be put to death. They were pissed. George Angus stayed in Savannah for only 2 weeks before he decided that in order to relieve tensions, he should move into the countryside. He stayed there for 2 months while things blew over. The next altercation with Parliament came in 1767 with the passage of the Townshend duties, a series of import taxes, a portion of which were to be used to pay the salaries of colonial officials. Since Georgia's officials, unlike the other 12 colonies, were paid by England directly already, it was hard for anyone really to get very excited about this law. Councilman Jonathan Bryan did complain but the king ordered Governor Wright to remove him from the council. When local rangers requisitioned provisions under the Quartering Act that same year, the assembly stood by and refused to comply, and then 2 months later they voluntarily gave the soldiers a stipend. In 1774, when Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts following the Boston Tea Party, Georgia didn't exactly rally to the cause of the Patriots to the north. The Sons of Liberty held meetings at Peter Tondy's Tavern, but Georgia was the only colony which did not send delegates to the First Continental Congress. Then shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. News of the battle arrived in Savannah May 10, 1775, and the Patriots took action, breaking into Fort Halifax and stealing 600 pounds of gunpowder. In June, persons unknown spiked the 21 cannon protecting the city and threw them down the bluff towards the river. Governor Wright had them hauled back up again, repaired, and they were in working order in time to fire salutes in honor of the king's birthday. He gave what was described as a genteel entertainment at the courthouse to the members of the council and the assembly, the public officers of the militia, and several other gentlemen. At the same time, there was a second party going on. The Sons of Liberty erected a liberty pole, then proceeded to Tondy's Tavern in utmost harmony and concluded the evening in great decorum. They too drank toasts to the king. The delicate, confused dance the people of Georgia were performing was becoming impossible to continue. People who didn't want to were forced to start choosing sides. James Habersham wrote in 1775, "Father against son, son against father, nearest relations and friends combating with each other, cutting each other's throats. Dreadful to think of, much less to experience." He was right. Families were dividing, often on generational lines. Members of the first generation of colonists in Georgia, such as Noble Jones and Habersham himself, remained loyal to the crown, while watching their sons, Noble Wimberley Jones and James, John, and Joseph Habersham, choose to side with the Patriots. And as people chose sides, things grew violent. The Sons of Liberty, upset at ship's pilot John Hopkins, ate to practice going on in other colonies when they tarred and feathered him in Johnson Square, the main square in the city. They carted him around town for 3 hours, threatening to hang him unless he toasted damnation to all Tories and success to American liberty. They formed a committee of safety, which threatened Hayden Smith, the rector of Christ Episcopal Church, when he refused to observe a fast and preach a sermon as directed by the Continental Congress. Then, finally, the first provincial Congress in Georgia met at Tondy's Tavern and elected Noble Wimberley Jones, Archibald Bullock, and John Houston as representatives to the Second Continental Congress. But only 5 parishes were represented at that meeting, and the 3 men refused to go. People living in that hotbed of patriotic fervor in the colony, St. John's Parish, surrounding Midway, Georgia, were so angry that they tried to secede from the colony, and they elected Lyman Hall to go to Philadelphia. But in the end, it didn't come to that. The Patriots held a second meeting with wider representation, re-elected Jones, Bullock, Houston, and Hall to appease the people of St. John's. But to balance Hall, they also added the minister of Independent Presbyterian Church, John Zubley, Sibley was noted for his fiery sermons, fiercely defending American rights, but he was also an avowed monarchist. He would never vote for independence. While all of this was going on, the royal government was still operating in Savannah. That changed when British ships arrived off Tybee Island at the mouth of the Savannah River in 1776. The Committee of Safety ordered Governor Wright's arrest, and Major Joseph Habersham did it single-handedly, plucking him from the middle of a council meeting. The committee put him under house arrest at his home, only to let him escape during the night. He returned to England. Without a government, in April, the Patriots created a state constitution and elected Archibald Bullock as the first president of the state of Georgia. Things finally began to seem clear in the new state. When Congress passed the Declaration of Independence, news reached Savannah August 8th. The Patriots read it 3 times around town and burned the king in effigy. But the new state government was far from stable. President Bullock died a few weeks later, and the Assembly replaced him with interim president and commander-in-chief Button Gwinnett, one of Georgia's signers of the Declaration. In the spring of 1777, instead of thinking about the defense of the state capital, Savannah, some Georgians were salivating at the prospect of invading Florida. Militia leader General Lachlan McIntosh proposed the idea to the Assembly, and when they voted down his plan, McIntosh called Gwinnett a scoundrel and lying rascal. Them's fighting words. Now remember, these guys are supposedly on the same side. Offended, Gwinnett challenged McIntosh to a duel in the middle of the Revolution. They met May 16, 1777, in Governor Wright's cow pasture. Both men were wounded, but Gwinnett died 12 days later. McIntosh thought it better if he left Georgia and went up to serve under General Washington. Which leads us to the First Battle of Savannah. British troops landed on Tybee Island December 23rd, 1778. There were 2,000 of them. In a futile delaying action, South Carolinian John Smith tried to slow down the British advance with 40 men. The man Congress had placed in charge of the southern defenses was General Benjamin Lincoln. In September, he was ordered to replace General Robert Howe, who had been more noted for his attention to women than for his defense preparations in Savannah. Lincoln had yet to arrive, so Howe was still in charge when the British landed. He hastily chose a site to make a stand, but he was not the only commander. George Walton was in charge of the state militia, and Governor John Houston, although he had no military experience whatsoever, was issuing orders. There was almost no coordination between the troops. Houston and Howe hated each other so much the two barely even spoke. It should be no wonder that the First Battle of Savannah was an unmitigated failure. Howe believed his position was impregnable, having burnt a bridge and diverted a creek to force the British straight into his path. But he hadn't counted on the animosity of African Americans. One elderly enslaved man, Quamino Dolly, showed the British a path through the marsh, outflanked Howe's position, and on December 29, 1778, caught him completely by surprise. It was a rout. There was utter chaos as Howe's men fled the field. The battle occurred at high tide, and many of the Americans drowned as they tried to escape through the swamps. At the end of the day, 83 Americans had been killed in battle, and 30 more had drowned. The British had 7 dead and 19 wounded. But more importantly, they captured 48 cannon, 23 mortars, 94 barrels of powder. They also had 550 American prisoners, including Mordecai Sheftel, the head of George's commissary, and his son, Sheftel, who hadn't escaped the field because he couldn't swim. 5 days after the battle, General Lincoln arrived. It's all about timing. With the British fully there's Sheftel. With the British fully ensconced in the city on January 4th, 1779, they offered amnesty to anyone who would renounce independence, 10 guineas reward for the capture of any assemblyman, and 2 guineas for any insurgents caught coming in from South Carolina. The British believed that Loyalist sentiment was so strong in Georgia that it could only have been the pressure from outside agitators that had persuaded anyone in the colony to join the rebellion in the first place. Hundreds of people took the oath and joined British militia units. Governor Wright returned in July, and Georgia had 2 functioning governments operating for the next 3 years. Some surprising people supported the British, including James Johnston, the editor of the Georgia Gazette, who had vehemently protested against the Stamp Act. He was back in Georgia, now publishing the Royal Georgia Gazette, supporting the Loyalist cause. John Zublin, that delegate to the Second Continental Congress, he turned Independent Presbyterian Church into a hospital for Hessian soldiers and became a British chaplain. The city's population swelled as Loyalists who had fled to Florida or gone into hiding joined the British ranks, and thousands of enslaved blacks came, tempted by the promise of freedom. And so the confused scene was now set for the Second Battle of Savannah. With Georgia's patriot government in chaos, the call to retake the city came mostly from frightened South Carolinians. The President of Congress, South Carolina's Henry Laurens, pushed to send Continental troops. The Congress sent that great American leader, Casimir Mikhail Władysław Victor Pulaski, and his legion. Meanwhile, South Carolina's governor, John Rutledge, sent letters to French Admiral Henri d'Estaing, begging him to send the French fleet. He did. 30 ships with 4,000 French, Irish, and Haitian troops. Pulaski. Lachlan McIntosh was back in Georgia, gathering up anyone he could find to spill the Georgia militias. He pulled together 300 volunteers, mostly South Carolinians, and he was joined by Francis Marion and the 1st and 2nd South Carolina regiments, bringing 1,500 regular troops from South Carolina. But d'Estaing got there first. On September 16th, he demanded that British General Augustin Prevost surrender to the King of France before Lincoln and McIntosh had even arrived in Savannah. By the time everybody finally showed up, the British had brought in reinforcements from Sunbury and Beaufort. They had dug in, and they were ready. No one had bothered to try to stop them. The word that best describes the scene as Americans and French attempted to put together their first joint military operation? Confusion. The Americans and the French had different perspectives on what they were doing in this war. The Americans would have liked nothing more than to have the French sweep in, take charge, and force the English out of the country. But the French were not going to do that. They had only joined the war following the victory at Saratoga, where after 2 years of fighting, the Americans finally had demonstrated that they had the will and the ability to win some battles. The French were hesitant to join the fray, and as evidenced by d'Estaing's moving ahead against the British, they just didn't trust the Americans. One officer wrote that the Americans are so badly armed, so badly clothed, and I must say, so badly commanded, that we could never turn them to much account. The Americans, they thought, had the will, but not the discipline to fight well, at least by European standards. The plan that d'Estaing developed called for the Allies to lay in siege to soften up British defenses. The armies were arrayed in 5 groups, 3 commanded by the French, 1 by Count Pulaski, and 1 by General Lincoln. Americans were not allowed into the French camps. They began firing October 3rd, after McIntosh sent Provost a request to evacuate women and children from the town, including his own family. Provost refused. The first shots went wild, and it took a while before the French artillery was able to hone in on the town, purportedly because instead of receiving a barrel of beer for provisions that morning, they'd gotten a barrel of rum. Eventually, though, they got it right and started striking Savannah's buildings, some as many as 50 times. The British, who were in short supply of shells, paid Savannah kids 6 pence for every French cannonball they recovered, so they could shoot it back at them. Despite damage to property, only 1 British soldier died during the bombardment, though that was not true for civilians. U.S. Major John Jones reported, "A number of the poor women and children have already been put to death by our bombs and cannon. Many of them were killed in their bed, and amongst others, a poor woman with an infant in her arms were destroyed by a cannonball. A more cruel war could not exist than this." Some 40 women and children were killed in the bombardment. But after 6 days, it was clear that the barrage was not working. But once again, honor. The same sense of honor that had caused Gwinnett and McIntosh to fight their duel convinced d'Estaing he needed to attack the city instead of lifting the siege. When he informed his officers of that decision, only 2 of them protested. 23-year-old Louis-Marie Vicomte de Noailles protested. d'Estaing said de Noailles' views were those of an old man. The other person who protested, calling this attack foolhardy, was Francis Marion. That was because the plan for the attack was complex and confusing, and success depended on utmost secrecy, coordination of several columns of troops of different nationalities, and nighttime maneuvers, difficult at any time, but particularly in the 18th century. The attack was to take place at the weakest point of the British line, Spring Hill Redoubt, on this side of the city, where approaching soldiers would have some cover and be able to surprise the British. The main assault would be made by 2 columns of French, Irish, and Haitian soldiers, 1,100 and 1,200 men each. while the Americans would make diversionary assaults on the eastern side of the city. Count Pulaski sent D'Estaing some alternative plans. Benjamin Lincoln didn't like the plan, but the Count's mind was made up. And so they all acquiesced. Since D'Estaing had the majority of troops and equipment, they really didn't have any other choice. Here is a reconstruction of Spring Hill Redoubt. It was completed about 4 years ago. If you're familiar with Savannah, it is off of Martin Luther King Boulevard, right by the Roundhouse. It is not actually the location. This is the reconstruction. The fort itself is mostly under a street located about 100 yards down the slope of the hill. Here's the reconstruction. The original is right here. The battle took place October 9th, and it lasted an hour. It is the bloodiest hour in the American Revolution. According to tradition, James Curry, an American serving in the Charleston Grenadiers, deserted to the British the day before and informed the British of their plans. There may have been an informer or spies, but in analyzing their situation, the British, under the command of Colonel John Maitland, simply may have realized the weakness of their position and reinforced Spring Hill Redoubt. Whatever, when the attack occurred, Maitland, a group of Scottish Highlanders, and 90 North Carolinians, sharpshooters, were sitting there waiting for the assault. And when the diversionary assaults came on the eastern side of the town, the British paid little attention. At dawn, thousands of French and Americans attacked the British positions, and they were cut down. Pulaski and Marion proved to be right when they complained. De Noailles, the others who had been concerned. The French launched 3 brave assaults on the fort, but they could not stand up to the British firepower. D'Estaing himself was wounded twice, the second time in the leg, and was hurt so badly he was almost left for dead. The Patriots reinforced the French, Irish, and Haitians. At the height of the battle's confusion, as the wounded D'Estaing tried to reform his troops before he fell finally. McIntosh troops, thrust far to the left in the swamp, were exposed to British naval fire from the river, as well as heavy grape shot from the fort. Major John Jones, the general's aide, who was within paces of an enemy cannon embrasure when he was cut in two by a cannonball. McIntosh was driven back under heavy enemy fire in the Allied retreat. The Continentals of the 2nd South Carolina, led by Francis Marion, succeeded in reaching the redoubt in brutal hand-to-hand combat on the parapet and fought Captain Thomas Towsey, the Loyalist commander. Sergeant William Jasper, who we heard about, the hero of Fort Sullivan, was there. Already the hero because of his actions in 1776, when he raised the regimental flag in defense of the British Navy. He was cut down as well and lay dying. Confusion reigned as Allied soldiers hurtled again and again. And when the order came to retreat, there were varying versions of what happened. In some accounts, Maitland counterattacked but turned aside when he saw an orderly American withdrawal. Others reported that there was such confusion that no 10 soldiers from the same unit arrived together, and the only reason they weren't slaughtered was because de Noailles, the French commander, came to their aid. Accounts also vary as to the number of casualties. British accounts placed their figures at 18 killed, 39 wounded, while the Allies suffered between 750 and 1,100 casualties. In total, it may have been the bloodiest hour. It was the second bloodiest battle of the entire Revolution. Only Breed's Hill was bloodier. From an American perspective, what was the aftermath and legacy of the Battle of Savannah? Well, not surprisingly, it's kind of confusing. Washington tried to put a good face on things. He wrote General Lincoln, "While I regret the misfortune, I feel very sensible pleasure in contemplating the gallant behavior of the officers and men of the French and American army. It adds not a little to my consolation to learn that instead of mutual reproaches, which too often follow the failure of enterprises depending upon the cooperation of troops of different nations, their confidence and esteem for each other are increased." That wasn't entirely true. A lot of blame was flying. French blaming Americans, Americans blaming the French, and a lot of people pointing fingers at D'Estaing. But then, the Georgia legislature turned around and granted the Count 20,000 acres of land and gave him citizenship in appreciation for his efforts. Some good did come out of the Battle of Savannah for the Americans. Immediately, the Count's death, Count Casimir Pulaski, who died mounting a foolish charge in the middle of enemy fire, became a martyr. And if British propaganda about the Count's military prowess was even remotely true, Pulaski did much more good for the Americans by dying than he could have as an officer. Cities, towns, roads, bridges are named for the fallen hero, and monuments were erected to his memory. This one in Savannah. The sacrifice of a European nobleman in the name of liberty inspired American troops. Similarly, South Carolina Sergeant William Jasper, mythologized by Parson Weems in 1809 through accounts of releasing American prisoners and dying during the battle trying to save his regimental flag once again, were born. Now, Parson Weems is the same guy who made up the story about George Washington and the cherry tree. So these may not be exactly true, but the legend was real, bringing pride and inspiration during the 19th century, particularly in South Carolina and in Georgia, where people mistakenly thought that he was Irish. And so the Hibernian Society raised a statue in his honor. He was probably German. There were some practical benefits from the battle as well. When D'Estaing appeared with the French fleet off the coast of Georgia, the British pulled their forces out of Rhode Island in order to counter the move, freeing that colony, which then became a base of operations for the French military. The French presence off of Georgia was also highly lucrative financially, with the seizure of $738,000 worth of British assets. That would be tens of millions of dollars in today's figures. And finally, there may have been a long-term effect to this tale of confusion. The British arrived in Georgia, banking on the fact that the colony was full of loyalist support. After the battle, they may have been lulled into a belief that the continued Loyalist support would propel them to an easy victory in the South, and ultimately all of the colonies. They moved into South Carolina, and 7 months later captured Charleston. But then began that long march through the Carolina backcountry and the constant harassment by American patriots, which ultimately forced Lord Cornwallis to seek refuge in a little tobacco port in Virginia called Yorktown. There, possibly because of the poor coordination at Savannah, the American and French military worked together seamlessly, finally bringing American independence, which from an American perspective, after all, was the entire point. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
I've got one on the promise of freedom for